A decision that changes everything. The grand mahogany doors of courtroom 5 loomed over 6-year-old Naomi and her twin brother Nathaniel as they stepped inside, their small hands clasped tightly together. The room smelled of polished wood and aged books, and the sunlight streaming through the high windows painted golden streaks across the floor. Naomi's heartbeat quickened as she took in the serious faces of the adults gathered around them: lawyers, social workers, and the couple who wanted to take them home. Judge Eleanor Monroe sat behind an imposing desk, her black robes crisp and her silver hair neatly pinned. Though her presence was formidable, there was a softness in her eyes as she adjusted her reading glasses and studied the twins before her. "Good morning, everyone," she said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had made life-changing decisions for many children before. "We are here today to finalize the adoption of Naomi and Nathaniel Wilson by Mr. and Mrs. Calloway." Naomi squeezed Nathaniel's hand harder. They had been here before, many times, in fact. But each time, something had felt wrong. And each time, they had refused. Across the aisle, the Calloways sat with polite, eager smiles. Mrs. Calloway was dressed in an elegant navy suit, her pearl earrings catching the light. Her husband sat beside her, his expensive watch glinting as he folded his hands neatly on his lap. They looked perfect, just like the others before them. Too perfect. The papers rustled as Judge Monroe turned to them. "Mr. and Mrs. Calloway, I see that your home study has been approved, and you have met with the children multiple times. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Mr. Calloway answered smoothly. "We've had several visits with Naomi and Nathaniel. We believe we can offer them a stable, loving home." Mrs. Calloway leaned forward slightly, her polished nails resting on the table. "We've already prepared a wonderful space for them. 2 separate rooms, each decorated to suit their individual personalities." Naomi felt Nathaniel stiffen beside her. 2 separate rooms, just like before. Judge Monroe nodded, making notes on the file before her. Then she turned her gaze toward the twins, her voice gentle. "Naomi, Nathaniel, do you understand what today is about?" Naomi swallowed hard and nodded, her fingers tightening around her brother's. She could feel his pulse racing under his skin. "It means we have a new home," Nathaniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. Judge Monroe offered them an encouraging smile. "That's right. And do you have anything you'd like to say about that?" For a moment, silence filled the courtroom. The adults leaned in, waiting for their response. Then, in perfect unison, the twins spoke. Not apart. The words were soft but firm, a quiet plea that echoed through the vast room. The judge's pen stopped mid-signature. The Calloways' expressions faltered. A ripple of unease passed through the gathered social workers. Judge Monroe leaned forward, her sharp eyes studying the twins. "Can you tell me why?" Naomi's voice trembled, but she spoke anyway. "We promised Mama we'd stay together." The judge's brows furrowed. She turned to their caseworker, Catherine Sims. "Ms. Sims, has there been any previous attempt to separate these children?" Catherine hesitated before nodding. "Yes, Your Honor. Several prospective families have requested to adopt only one of them. Each time, the children have refused or shown severe distress when placed apart." Judge Monroe glanced down at the file, flipping through the pages. Naomi saw her eyes soften slightly as she paused on a photograph. It was their last picture with their mother. Their real mother. The only person who had ever truly understood them. She looked back up. "Mrs. Calloway, Mr. Calloway, would you be willing to accommodate the children's request to stay together?" A flicker of hesitation crossed Mr. Calloway's face, but his wife answered smoothly. "We believe fostering their independence is important. Twins often become overly reliant on each other, and separating them would allow them to develop as individuals." Naomi's chest tightened. No, they didn't understand. No one ever did. Judge Monroe's gaze lingered on them, as if weighing something deep in her mind. Then, with a decisive movement, she set down her pen. "I believe this case requires further review." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The Calloway's smiles vanished, replaced by polite disappointment. Catherine nodded subtly, as if she had seen this coming. Naomi exhaled the breath she had been holding. For now, they were safe. But the fight was far from over. Secrets in the file. The heavy case file sat open on Judge Eleanor Monroe's desk, its pages filled with official documents, notes, and reports. Each one a carefully written piece of the twins' history. The courtroom had long since emptied, but the weight of the morning's events still hung in the air. Judge Monroe removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. The children's voices echoed in her mind. Not apart. Those two words, simple yet powerful, had stopped everything. The Calloways, with their perfect house and pristine reputation, had hesitated when asked about keeping the twins together. Monroe had seen too many cases like this, families who believed they were doing the right thing, but who failed to see the invisible threads that tied children together in ways that even blood couldn't explain. She sighed and flipped back through the twins' file. Naomi and Nathaniel Wilson. Age: 6. No known relatives. Entered the foster system at age 4. She paused on a worn photograph paper-clipped to one of the reports. It showed a woman with tired but gentle eyes, her dark hair pulled back in a loose braid. Naomi and Nathaniel sat on either side of her, their small hands clasped together. Their mother, Rachel Wilson, deceased. Monroe ran her fingers over the edges of the photo. There was something about Rachel's eyes, something knowing, something determined. She turned the page and frowned as she read a series of notes left by social workers over the years. Attempted placement number 1. The Henderson family only wanted one child. Both children refused. Attempted placement number 2. The Whitman family. Trial separation for a weekend. Nathaniel stopped eating. Naomi refused to speak. Placement terminated. Attempted placement number 3. The Lathams. Considered separating them, but changed their minds after witnessing concerning behavioral responses. Monroe's jaw tightened. This wasn't just sibling attachment, it was survival. Her pen tapped against the desk as she turned to a more recent note, dated just 3 months ago. Children continue to resist separation. Strong attachment likely rooted in trauma. Naomi exhibits symptoms of selective mutism when placed without Nathaniel. Nathaniel displays signs of severe anxiety. Recommend keeping them together when possible. Monroe's thoughts drifted back to the courtroom, to the way Naomi had squeezed Nathaniel's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. The way Nathaniel had watched his sister like a shadow, waiting for her to decide their fate. A promise. Monroe leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. She had seen this kind of bond before. Sometimes, when siblings endured trauma together, they became each other's lifeline. Taking one away from the other would be like removing a lung. Sure, they might survive, but not without pain. She needed more. With a quick decision, she reached for the phone and dialed Catherine Sims' number. It rang twice before the social worker picked up. Judge Monroe. Catherine, Monroe said, glancing again at the file. I need more information on the Wilson twins. Specifically, I need anything you can find about their mother. There was a pause on the other end. Rachel Wilson. Catherine asked carefully. Why? Because, Monroe said, flipping back to the photograph. I have a feeling we've been missing something. A shadowed past. That evening, Catherine sat at her desk, a stack of folders spread before her. The caseworker's office was small but organized, every file arranged neatly in metal drawers that lined the wall. She had seen hundreds of cases pass through her hands, but something about Naomi and Nathaniel's story didn't sit right with her. She pulled out a manila folder with Rachel Wilson's name written across the top in faded ink. This file hadn't been touched in years. She opened it and scanned the contents. Rachel had died in a hospital. Cause of death: complications from pneumonia. No family listed. No emergency contact. Catherine frowned. No family. That was unusual. Most children had someone. A grandparent, a cousin, even a distant aunt. She flipped through the hospital records, pausing at a section labeled Final Request. Her breath caught as she read the handwritten note beneath it. If anything happens to me, please make sure Naomi and Nathaniel stay together. They need each other. It was signed with Rachel's shaky signature, written just days before she died. Catherine's chest tightened. How had this been buried in paperwork? Why had no one noticed? Grabbing her phone, she called Monroe immediately. "You were right," she said as soon as the judge picked up. "Rachel Wilson left a final request. She asked for her children to stay together." There was a long pause. Monroe exhaled. "Send me everything you have." And Catherine, "Yes. We need to find someone who actually wants them both." Meanwhile, at the group home, Naomi and Nathaniel sat huddled together on their small twin bed in the group home, whispering beneath the thin blanket. "Do you think they'll make us go?" Nathaniel asked, his voice barely audible. Naomi swallowed hard. "I don't know." They had been through this before. New homes, new people, new rules, but always the same fear that one day someone would decide they weren't meant to be together. Naomi looked down at the charm bracelet on her wrist, the only thing she had left from their mother. "Stay together," she had whispered to them before she got sick. No matter what. A noise from the hallway made them freeze. Footsteps. The door creaked open, and Ms. Abigail, the group home supervisor, peeked inside. Her kind face softened when she saw them. "Hey, little ones," she said gently. "It's late. You should be asleep." Naomi tightened her grip on Nathaniel's hand. Ms. Abigail hesitated, then sighed. "Listen, I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know one thing. You two are stronger together than apart, and I think Judge Monroe sees that too." She offered them a small smile before turning off the light. The door clicked shut. Silence filled the room once more. Naomi turned to Nathaniel. "We won't let them separate us," she whispered fiercely. Nathaniel nodded, his small fingers gripping hers like a lifeline. "Not ever." Outside, the moon hung low in the sky, casting silver streaks across the window. Somewhere beyond those walls, decisions were being made. People were fighting for them. But for now, all they could do was wait. And hope. A family in the shadows. The wind howled against the towering brick walls of the group home as Naomi lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Nathaniel's soft breaths beside her were steady, his small hand still clasped in hers. It was how they always slept, together, fingers intertwined like vines. But tonight, something felt different. The decision had been delayed. That meant something. Judge Monroe had listened to them, really listened, but Naomi wasn't naive enough to believe that meant they were safe. Adults had a way of doing what they thought was best, even if it wasn't, even if it hurt. She turned onto her side and studied her twin's face in the dim moonlight. He looked peaceful, but she knew better. Knew the way he curled into himself when he was scared. Knew that the faint crease between his brows meant bad dreams. If they tried to take him away, she'd fight. She'd run. Nathaniel stirred slightly, his grip tightening. "Naomi?" His voice was thick with sleep. "I'm here." His breathing slowed again, and he drifted off. Naomi didn't sleep that night. An unexpected call. Judge Monroe sat in her dimly lit chambers, the city skyline twinkling beyond the window. The case file lay open before her, the worn edges of Rachel Wilson's photograph curling slightly. She traced the image with her fingertips, her thoughts tangled in a web of possibilities. The Callaways were out. That much was clear. But who was left? She rubbed her temples and glanced at the clock. Nearly midnight. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on her chest. She had made difficult decisions before, had separated siblings when necessary, had placed children with families she hoped would love them enough. But Naomi and Nathaniel weren't just any siblings. They had survived too much. She reached for her coffee, now cold, when her phone buzzed. "Catherine." Monroe's stomach tightened. She answered immediately. "Tell me you have something." "I have someone." Monroe sat up straighter. They applied last year, Catherine continued, rustling papers on the other end. A couple, James and Evelyn Carter. They wanted to adopt twins. Monroe frowned. And they were denied, Catherine admitted. James lost his job right before the home study. They couldn't prove financial stability. Monroe exhaled. That happened more than she liked to admit. A family perfectly capable of loving a child denied because of numbers on a page. But things have changed, Catherine added quickly. James is back at work. Steady income. They just haven't reapplied. Why not? A pause. Because they were heartbroken, Monroe, Catherine said, quieter now. They fell in love with a set of twins that got placed with someone else. I think they stopped trying. The judge drummed her fingers against her desk. Find them, she said finally. See if they still want a family. The Carters. The scent of sawdust and motor oil lingered in the crisp autumn air as James Carter wiped his hands on a rag, his tired eyes studying the half-finished wooden shelf in his garage. Evelyn stood at the doorway, arms crossed, watching him. You don't have to keep building things for them, she said gently. James exhaled. I know. She walked over, brushing a layer of dust off a small wooden toy chest in the corner, one of many things James had made for the children they never got. It's been a year, she murmured. I know, he repeated, voice hoarse. He had known, knew the exact number of days since their last home study, knew that their spare bedroom remained untouched, knew that Evelyn still checked the adoption listing sometimes, even when she thought he wasn't looking. Maybe we should try again, she whispered. James clenched his jaw. And what if it's another no? Evelyn swallowed, her eyes shining. What if it isn't? Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with unspoken pain. Then the phone rang. They both stared at it. Neither moved. Finally, Evelyn reached for it, pressing it to her ear. Hello. She listened for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she turned to James. It's about the twins, she said. And just like that, their world tilted. A meeting that changes everything. Naomi and Nathaniel sat in a too-big office, their legs swinging slightly off the chairs. The woman across from them, Evelyn Carter, smiled warmly, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She didn't look like the others. She wasn't dressed like the Callaways, in clothes too perfect, too polished. She wore a sweater with little threads unraveling at the sleeves. Her hands had faint flour stains, like she had been baking before she came here. James Carter sat beside her, hands clasped, looking a little more uncertain. He had rough hands, like someone who built things. Naomi narrowed her eyes. People who built things also knew how to break them. Judge Monroe sat at her desk, watching carefully. Naomi. Nathaniel. This is Mr. and Mrs. Carter. They want to talk with you. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. Hi, sweethearts, she said softly. It's really nice to meet you. Nathaniel stiffened beside Naomi. She didn't say anything. Evelyn hesitated, glancing at her husband, then reached into her bag. I brought something. She pulled out a small sketchpad and a set of crayons, placing them on the desk. Ms. Sims told me you like to draw, she said. Naomi's fingers twitched, but she wouldn't trust it. They all tried to act nice at first. Nathaniel was the first to break the silence. Would we have our own room? James cleared his throat. We have 2 rooms ready, if that's what you want. He glanced at Naomi. But if you'd rather share, that's okay too. Naomi's heart pounded. The Callaways had never given them a choice. James rubbed the back of his neck. I also build things. I made a treehouse in our backyard. He hesitated. It has a telescope, if you like looking at stars. Nathaniel sat up straighter. Really? James nodded. Naomi narrowed her eyes at him. What if we don't like it? Evelyn smiled. Then we try again. And again. Until we found what makes you feel safe. Naomi studied her. Most adults wanted answers now, wanted them to behave, to fit neatly into their perfect family puzzle. But this woman was patient. "You'd really try again?" Nathaniel asked hesitantly. Evelyn nodded. "As many times as it takes." The room went silent, and for the first time, Naomi felt something shift. Something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Hope. The test of trust. The next morning, Naomi sat on the edge of her bed at the group home, absently twisting the charm bracelet around her wrist. The room smelled like laundry detergent and a lingering scent of maple syrup from breakfast. Nathaniel sat across from her, cross-legged on his bed, bouncing a rubber ball against the wall. Thunk, thunk, catch. "You think they're different?" he asked, not looking up. Naomi hesitated. She didn't want to answer. Because the truth was, she wasn't sure. The Carters seemed different. They hadn't forced smiles the whole time. They hadn't looked uncomfortable when she and Nathaniel refused to answer their questions. They hadn't promised things that sounded too good to be real. But promises didn't mean anything. Nathaniel bounced the ball again, staring at the wall. "I think I like them." Naomi's stomach twisted. She wanted to like them too. But that was the problem. "We've liked people before," she reminded him. "And every time, it ended the same way." Nathaniel nodded slowly. He knew. He always knew. But what if this time is different? Naomi didn't have an answer for that. A knock at the door made them both freeze. Ms. Abigail, the group home supervisor, peeked in, her expression gentle. "Time to go, little ones," she said softly. "The Carters are waiting." Nathaniel shot Naomi a quick glance before slipping off his bed. She hesitated, staring at the old scuff marks on the wooden floor. Then, reluctantly, she followed. "A house that feels like home." The Carters' house wasn't big. It wasn't perfect, either. The paint on the porch railing was chipped. The steps creaked when Naomi climbed them. The door had a tiny scratch near the handle, like a dog had once pawed at it. It didn't look like a magazine home. It looked lived in. Evelyn met them at the door, her apron dusted with flour. A streak of it on her cheek. She didn't seem to notice or care. "Hi, sweethearts," she said warmly. "Come on in." Naomi hesitated, then stepped inside. The house smelled like cinnamon and something warm, something safe. The living room wasn't arranged in neat, untouched perfection. There were shoes by the door, a book left open on the couch, and a colorful quilt draped over the armrest. Nathaniel nudged Naomi. "Look," he whispered. A framed picture sat on the mantel. It was of them. The same picture Judge Monroe had on her desk. Their mother, Rachel, smiling between them, their tiny hands clutching hers. Naomi's heart pounded. "You kept that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn wiped her hands on her apron. "Of course." James appeared in the doorway, rubbing the back of his neck. "We wanted you to know she's part of this too," he said. "She's part of you." Naomi swallowed hard. No one had ever said that before. Evelyn clapped her hands. "All right, how about a tour?" The kitchen was cozy, with hanging pots and mismatched plates. The backyard had a giant oak tree with a wooden swing. But it was the bedrooms that made Naomi freeze. One room was decorated in soft blues, a rocket ship poster on the wall. The other was purple, with a desk covered in brand-new drawing supplies. 2 rooms. Naomi's throat tightened. "We can share, right?" she asked, gripping Nathaniel's hand. Evelyn and James exchanged a glance, then smiled. "Of course," James said. "However you want it." No arguments. No forced independent speeches. Just choice. Nathaniel let out a breath. Naomi hadn't realized he'd been holding it. Maybe this wasn't like before. Maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. A test of trust. That night, Naomi couldn't sleep. The bed was too soft. The air smelled too clean. The ceiling wasn't the one she was used to staring at when she couldn't stop thinking. Beside her, Nathaniel was already doozing, his breathing slow and steady. Naomi sat up and pulled her sketchbook from the nightstand. She flipped to a blank page and picked up a pencil, her fingers tracing over the smooth surface. She started drawing the Carter's house. The chipped paint, the creaky steps, the mismatched plates. She added the framed picture on the mantel. Then, carefully, she drew herself and Nathaniel in front of it. A test. If they stayed, she'd keep it. If not, she'd tear it up. She set the sketchbook aside, curled up next to Nathaniel, and finally let herself drift off to sleep. The first mistake. The next morning, Naomi woke to the smell of bacon. She rubbed her eyes and stretched, feeling the warmth of a blanket she hadn't remembered pulling over herself. Nathaniel was already up, bouncing at the edge of the bed. "Come on," he whispered excitedly. "I think we get pancakes." Naomi wasn't convinced pancakes meant anything, but she got up anyway. Downstairs, Evelyn stood at the stove, flipping golden pancakes onto a plate while James set the table. The morning light poured through the kitchen windows, making everything look impossibly warm. Nathaniel slid into a chair, practically vibrating with excitement. Naomi hesitated. Then she heard it. Clink. The sound of 2 plates. She frowned, stepping closer. 2 plates, not 3. Evelyn caught her staring and followed her gaze. She sighed, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Sweetheart, we thought you didn't eat much last night. We weren't sure if you'd want some this morning." Naomi's stomach twisted. They didn't think I'd stay. She clenched her fists. It was always the same. Always almost safe, almost home, almost loved. Until something went wrong. Evelyn's face fell. "Naomi, we..." "Forget it," Naomi snapped, stepping back. "I'm not hungry anyway." Nathaniel gave her a worried look. "Naomi." She turned on her heel and bolted. The choice. Naomi sat at the bottom of the treehouse ladder, her arms wrapped around her knees. She'd known better. She always knew better. Behind her, footsteps crunched against the leaves. She didn't look up. James sat down a few feet away, far enough that she didn't feel trapped. He didn't say anything right away. Then, "You know, when I was a kid, I used to run too." Naomi frowned. James picked up a stray twig and twirled it between his fingers. "Whenever I thought people didn't really want me around, I figured if I left first, it wouldn't hurt as bad." Naomi's throat tightened. "I know we messed up," he said after a pause. "We should have made you a plate. That was our mistake, not yours." She looked at him then. "You're not gonna make me go inside." James shrugged. "You come when you're ready." Naomi stared at him. "That's new." James tossed the twig aside and stood. "For what it's worth, we do want you here, even if we get things wrong sometimes." He ruffled her hair lightly, then turned to leave. Naomi hesitated. "James?" He turned. She swallowed. "Are there still pancakes?" His grin was slow, warm, always. And for the first time, Naomi thought, "Maybe I don't have to run this time." Learning to stay. Naomi followed James back inside, her steps slow, hesitant. The kitchen was quieter than before, but the smell of pancakes still lingered in the air, warm and sweet. Evelyn was rinsing dishes at the sink, her shoulders tense, but when she turned and saw Naomi standing there, a flicker of relief crossed her face. "Still hungry?" she asked gently. Naomi gave a small nod, not trusting her voice. Evelyn dried her hands and motioned toward the table. "Then sit down, sweetheart. Let me fix you a plate." Naomi hesitated before climbing into the chair next to Nathaniel. He gave her a cautious glance, like he wasn't sure if she was staying or running again. She wasn't sure either. James sat down across from them, pouring a fresh cup of coffee. He acted like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just stormed out and almost left for good. Naomi wasn't used to that. In other homes, a mistake like that meant whispers, long talks about bad behavior, or worst of all, being told she was ungrateful. But here, nothing. Just another plate set in front of her, stacked with pancakes drizzled in syrup. Like it was normal. Like she belonged. Nathaniel gave her a little nudge. "They're really good," he whispered, mouth half full. Naomi picked up her fork. The first bite was warm and soft, the taste melting on her tongue. She tried to ignore the unfamiliar feeling creeping into her chest, something strange and terrifying. Hope. She swallowed hard. Evelyn reached across the table, nudging a small cup of orange juice toward her. "James makes the best pancakes," she said casually, like it wasn't a big deal that Naomi had just broken down outside. "It's his secret recipe." James took a sip of his coffee. "It's called adding cinnamon." Nathaniel's eyes widened. "That's your secret?" James shrugged. "It works, doesn't it?" Nathaniel laughed, and Naomi felt something inside her loosen just a little. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Exploring the house. After breakfast, Evelyn led the twins upstairs, their hands still sticky from syrup. "I figured today could be an easy day," she said. "No pressure, just exploring. See how you like things." The upstairs hallway was lined with family photos, pictures of Evelyn and James at the beach, a blurry one of James holding a puppy, another of Evelyn covered in flour while holding a tray of cookies. But there were no kids in the pictures. Naomi frowned. "You never had kids before?" she asked. Evelyn's smile softened. "No, but we always wanted them." Nathaniel looked up at her, studying her face. "Then why didn't you?" Evelyn hesitated. "It just never happened, not for us." James leaned against the doorframe of one of the rooms. "That's why we wanted to adopt." Naomi stared at them both, searching their faces for the kind of lies she was used to, but she didn't see any. She still didn't trust it, but she wanted to. Evelyn cleared her throat, as if shaking away old memories, and nudged open the door to what would have been Naomi's room. "We weren't sure what you'd like, so we kept things simple," she said. The room was painted a soft lavender, and in the far corner sat a small desk covered in fresh drawing supplies, markers, colored pencils, and blank sketchbooks. Naomi's heart jumped. "We can change anything, of course," Evelyn added. "It's your space." Naomi reached out, running her fingers over the smooth wooden desk. No one had ever given her a space before. Not really. But she still wasn't ready to let go of the fear in her chest. "You can change things?" she asked, just to test them. "Of course," James said. "We're not here to make rules about what you like. We're just here to make sure you feel safe." Safe. That was another thing she wasn't used to. A forgotten feeling. By the afternoon, the twins had settled in more than Naomi wanted to admit. Nathaniel had already claimed a spot on the couch, flipping through a book about space while James worked in the garage. Naomi stayed by the window, sketching in her new notebook. She wasn't sure how it had happened, but she had already started drawing the Carter's house again. This time, she added a swing in the backyard. Evelyn walked by, carrying a basket of laundry, and paused. "You like to draw a lot, don't you?" she asked. Naomi stiffened, then nodded. Evelyn smiled. "You don't have to hide it, you know. I love art. I'm terrible at it, but I love it." Naomi studied her. "Then why do you have drawings on the fridge?" Evelyn laughed. "Those are James." Naomi blinked. "James draws." Evelyn leaned in. "Not well." Naomi cracked a smile before she could stop herself. "Hey, that's a rare sight," Evelyn teased. "You've got a great smile, kid." Naomi quickly looked back down at her drawing, embarrassed. No one ever pointed it out when she smiled. Usually, they just talked about how quiet she was. "James is working on something outside," Evelyn added. "Want to see?" Naomi hesitated. Then, cautiously, she closed her notebook and followed. A place to stay. James stood in the backyard, sanding down a wooden frame. Naomi smelled the sawdust before she saw what he was building. It was a treehouse. A real treehouse. "You're making that?" she asked, stepping closer. James grinned. "Not just me. I was thinking you and Nathaniel could help." Nathaniel's head popped up from behind the porch steps. "We can help." "Of course," James said. "That is, if you're staying." Naomi swallowed. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a trick. It was a choice. She felt Nathaniel's eyes on her, waiting. But this was hers to decide. Slowly, she reached out, running her fingers along the smooth wood. "You sanded this," she murmured. James nodded. "Every inch." She hesitated. Then, almost too quiet to hear, she whispered, "Can I help paint it?" James grinned. "Absolutely." Naomi's fingers curled around the edge of the frame. It was solid. Real. For the first time, she let herself believe it might actually be hers. That night, when she returned to her sketchbook, she flipped to the drawing she had made of the Carter's house. And for the first time, she didn't rip it up. She kept it. Just in case, when the past comes knocking. The days at the Carter house were different. Not perfect, but different. Naomi and Nathaniel were still learning the rules, still figuring out the spaces where they belonged. But the strangest part was, there weren't as many rules as they expected. No cold silences when they did something wrong. No overly cheerful, fake voices meant to keep them in line. Just people. People who left books open on the couch. People who made pancakes with cinnamon. People who built treehouses for no reason other than because. And for the first time in a long time, Naomi let herself almost believe this could be home. Until the past found them again. The Callaways' return. The knock on the door was sharp, precise. Naomi and Nathaniel had been at the kitchen table, working on a puzzle while Evelyn folded laundry nearby. James was outside, still finishing the treehouse. The moment the knock came, Naomi felt a cold shiver down her spine. Evelyn wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked to the door, opening it without hesitation. Naomi's stomach dropped. Mrs. Callaway stood on the porch, dressed in the same crisp, elegant suit she had worn in court, her pearl earrings gleaming in the afternoon sun. Mr. Callaway stood beside her, hands clasped, his posture as perfect as ever. Everything about them looked wrong against the Carter house. Too polished, too neat, too dangerous. Evelyn's smile faltered slightly, but she held firm. "Can I help you?" Mrs. Callaway smiled, but there was something cold behind it. "We were just in the neighborhood and thought we'd check in on the children." Evelyn's eyes flicked toward Naomi and Nathaniel, then back to the couple. "That's not necessary. We just want to see them," Mrs. Callaway pressed. "Make sure they're doing well." Naomi's hands clenched into fists under the table. This wasn't a visit. This was a warning. A reminder that they weren't safe yet. Nathaniel shifted beside her, his body tense. "We don't want to see them," he whispered under his breath. Evelyn stood taller. "I'm sorry, but I don't believe that would be appropriate. If you have any concerns, you can take them up with Judge Monroe." For the first time, Mrs. Callaway's perfect expression cracked. Just a little. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice just above a whisper. Evelyn didn't flinch. "I don't think I am." The Callaways exchanged a look, something silent passing between them. Mr. Callaway exhaled sharply through his nose, then adjusted his cufflinks like this was just another business transaction. "We'll be in touch," he said smoothly. And just like that, they turned and walked away. Evelyn shut the door, locking it behind them. She turned to Naomi and Nathaniel. "Are you okay?" Naomi's breath felt trapped in her chest, but she forced herself to nod. Nathaniel didn't move for a long moment. Then he whispered, "They're going to try to take us back, aren't they?" Evelyn's jaw tightened. "Not if I have anything to say about it." A hard truth. That night, Naomi couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet creaks of the house as the wind rattled the windows. The Callaways were coming back. Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But they weren't finished. And Naomi knew better than anyone that when people wanted something badly enough, They found a way to get it. She slipped out of bed as quietly as she could, careful not to wake Nathaniel, and crept to the hallway. The house was dark, but a faint glow came from downstairs. Voices. Naomi moved carefully, making her way down the steps, staying just out of sight. Evelyn and James sat at the kitchen table, papers spread out in front of them. Judge Monroe's name was on one of the documents. They still have legal standing, James was saying, his voice low. They're pushing for another hearing. Evelyn's fingers curled around the edges of the paper. They don't even want them both, she hissed. They'd never wanted them both. They just want to win. Naomi's chest tightened. Evelyn pushed her hands through her hair. We can't lose them, James. We can't. James reached for her hand. We won't. Naomi felt something sting behind her eyes. She turned and hurried back upstairs before they could see her. The escape plan. Naomi shook Nathaniel awake, her heart pounding. What? He blinked, groggy. We have to go, Naomi whispered. Now. Nathaniel sat up, rubbing his eyes. What are you talking about? They're going to take us, Nat, she said, voice tight. The Callaways. We can't let them. Nathaniel stared at her for a long moment, then whispered, Where would we even go? Naomi hesitated. She hadn't thought that far, but they had run before. Foster homes, shelters, places where no one looked twice at two small kids blending into the background. They could do it again. It was the only way to make sure they stayed together. She grabbed her backpack and started stuffing it with clothes. It doesn't matter. We just have to go before they make the choice for us. Nathaniel didn't move. Naomi, he said softly, Evelyn and James aren't like the others. She clenched her jaw. You don't know that. He looked at her, something too old in his small face. Yeah, I do. She swallowed hard. Then why are they talking about court? Because they're fighting for us. Naomi's fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack. Fighting for them. No one had ever done that before. For the first time, she didn't know what to do. Nathaniel reached out and gently took the backpack from her hands. Just wait, he said. One more day. If they don't fight, we go. One more day. It felt impossible. But Naomi sat down anyway. A choice no one else could make. The next morning, Judge Monroe arrived at the house. She sat in the living room with James and Evelyn while Naomi and Nathaniel perched on the edge of the couch, waiting. You have a decision to make, Monroe said, her sharp eyes locking onto them. Naomi held her breath. You can fight this with us, Monroe continued. We'll go back to court, and I'll make sure you have a voice. She leaned forward. Or you can run. But I need you to know this. If you do, you'll lose everything. The air felt too thick. Naomi gripped Nathaniel's hand. This was it. The real test. Monroe's voice softened. You get to decide this time, Naomi. Naomi's heart pounded. She looked at Evelyn, at James, at Nathaniel. Then she let out a slow, shaky breath, and for the first time in her life, she chose to stay. A family worth fighting for. The courtroom felt colder than Naomi remembered. The wooden benches, the tall windows, the scent of old books, it was all the same. But this time, something was different. This time, she wasn't just a shadow in the background, waiting for grown-ups to decide her future. This time, she was fighting too. Naomi's fingers tightened around Nathaniel's hand as they sat between James and Evelyn at the long table. Judge Monroe sat high above them, her silver hair pinned back, her expression unreadable. Across the aisle, the Callaways sat stiffly, their lawyer flipping through neat stacks of paperwork. Naomi hated them, not because they were cruel, not because they had hurt her, but because they refused to see her. To them, she and Nathaniel weren't people. They were things to be won. The fight for forever. The Callaways' lawyer stood first. Your Honor, my clients have met every requirement for adoption. They are financially secure, emotionally stable, and prepared to provide a child with an excellent future. We believe the court's previous decision was incorrect and that this adoption should proceed." Monroe nodded, her gaze calm. "And you're requesting adoption of both children?" A brief, almost imperceptible hesitation. Then, "At this time, we are seeking custody of Naomi. Nathaniel would be placed in another suitable home." A hush fell over the courtroom. Nathaniel stiffened beside her. Naomi's stomach turned. Mrs. Calloway folded her hands in her lap, her pearl bracelet clinking softly. "Naomi would thrive in our home. We want to give her every opportunity to reach her full potential. And Nathaniel." "We promised," Naomi blurted out. Everyone turned to her. Naomi's throat burned, but she lifted her chin. "We promised Mama we'd stay together." Judge Monroe studied her. "Miss Wilson," she said gently, "do you understand that this decision will affect the rest of your life?" Naomi nodded, her heart pounding. "That's why I want to choose." Monroe glanced at the Calloways. "And what do you say to that?" Mrs. Calloway's lips pursed. "With all due respect, Your Honor, Naomi is a child. She may not understand what's truly best for her." Naomi clenched her fists. "I understand that you don't love both of us," she snapped. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Mrs. Calloway's expression darkened. "That's not fair," Mr. Calloway said smoothly. "We simply believe it would be in both children's best interest to be raised separately." Naomi turned to Judge Monroe, her voice shaking but strong. "I'd rather have nothing than be without Nathaniel." Monroe's sharp eyes flicked between her and Nathaniel. Then she turned to James and Evelyn. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," she said, "do you have anything to say?" Evelyn took a slow breath. Then she stood. "I don't think Naomi should have to beg for what's already hers." James rose beside her. "We didn't come here to take just one child. We didn't come here because we wanted a prize. We came here because they belong together." Monroe nodded, silent for a long moment. Then she turned to Naomi and Nathaniel. "You've made yourselves very clear," she said. And with that, she picked up her pen. The courtroom held its breath. Then, the scratch of ink against paper. "A forever home." Naomi didn't hear the rest. Not really. There were gasps, murmurs, people standing. The Calloways were furious. Their lawyer tried to argue, but Judge Monroe's voice rang through the room like a gavel striking wood. "The adoption is finalized. Naomi and Nathaniel Wilson are now legally James and Evelyn Carter's children." Naomi blinked. It was real. Real in a way that nothing had ever been real before. She turned to Evelyn, searching her face. Evelyn smiled, tears in her eyes. "Welcome home, sweetheart." Naomi looked at James. He grinned. "You're stuck with us now." And then, before she could think, before she could second guess, Naomi threw herself into their arms. James caught her. Evelyn wrapped them both up. Nathaniel grabbed onto them, too, and suddenly they were one big tangled mess of family. Not a perfect family. Not an easy family. But theirs. Learning to stay. The first night in the Carter house, as officially Naomi Carter felt. The same. And completely different. She and Nathaniel still curled up in the same bed, still whispered in the dark. But something was missing. Something heavy. The fear. The doubt. The feeling that they were temporary. Instead, Naomi lay staring at the ceiling, her hand resting on her sketchbook. Earlier that night, Evelyn had walked by and seen her drawing. "That's beautiful," she had said softly. Naomi had stiffened. But Evelyn didn't tell her to hide it. She didn't say it was a silly hobby. She just pointed at the page and asked, "Is that us?" Naomi had looked down at her drawing. The Carter house, with the treehouse beside it. The four of them standing in front of it, their hands linked. Her fingers had curled around the edge of the paper. And for the first time, she hadn't wanted to run. She had just nodded. Evelyn had smiled and squeezed her shoulder. "Then we should hang it up." Naomi had let her. And now, as she lay in bed, staring at the faint glow of the hallway light under the door, she realized something else. She wanted to paint the treehouse. For the first time, she didn't want to disappear. She wanted to stay, a future worth holding on to. A week later, the Carter family stood in the backyard, paint cans scattered around them. Naomi dipped her brush into the blue paint, carefully dragging it along the wooden frame of the treehouse. "Nice work," James said beside her, painting the railing. Nathaniel stood on the ladder, painting the window trim. Evelyn was nearby, adding little flowers at the base. "I want to paint something else," Naomi said suddenly. James wiped his hands on his jeans. "What's that?" She bit her lip. Then, carefully, she climbed up the steps, brush in hand. She found the perfect spot, right by the door, where it would be the first thing anyone saw when they entered. And with slow, careful strokes, she painted 4 figures standing together. Too tall, too small. A family. Their family. Evelyn gasped softly when she saw it. Nathaniel beamed. "That's us." James cleared his throat, looking suspiciously like he might cry. Naomi stepped back, her heart pounding. Then she felt Evelyn's arms wrap around her. "We love you, sweetheart," she whispered. And for the first time, Naomi believed it. She wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. She wasn't holding her breath. She was home. She was safe, and she was finally staying.